Welcome from COP26 in Glasgow. This is day 8, and I'm really happy to welcome our panelists, our viewers online, and everybody else, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of both organizations, the FAO and the UNDP, I'm very, very happy to be moderating the session today, which is on engaging the private sector to implement agriculture and land use under NDCs, National Determined Contributions, and NAPs, National Adaptation Plans. This event is being held in the MDB Pavilion, and we are really grateful for having the spot here today for exchange and further discussions, and it's organized in particular with the African Development Bank. So this event, I also like to outline that, is organized through the SCALA program, which stands for Scaling Up Climate Ambition on Land Use and Agriculture under the NDC and NAP, which is a program supported by the German government, in particular the International Climate Initiative. And we will hear more about the ICI and about the program later on. But herewith, I'd like to do some housekeeping announcements. So we have a great event. So the event is being recorded. We have in-person speakers here, which is great to have. And we have virtual speakers, so it's the famous hybrid events we do here a lot at COP26. Let me do some welcoming words as well. So today is a very important day for adaptation. There was a high-level panel meeting this morning where a lot of climate finance pitches were done. And it's very important to recognize that there's a huge gap for implementation. So the COP is not only a place where you think about rules and regulations about finishing the rule book under the Paris Agreement, but it's actually to talk about action and the need for finance and the need for country support. And we hear more about that. Our particular event is to ask the question how to better bring in the private sector and how to create enabling environments for the private sector to feel incentivized to invest both at national and local levels. And we do a deep dive, let's say, and dialogue with the panelists in person and online to learn more about that. Today is also a particular event because we will launch a SCALA, a technical assistance facility that supports, in particular, least developed countries in their efforts to engage with the private sector. And we hear more about that. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first esteemed panelist, Birte Derricks. She's working for the German Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Nuclear Safety, and in particular for the International Climate Initiative. Birte, I'm really pleased to have you here. You're a policy advisor to the ministry. I'll hand over the floor to you for the welcoming words.
Okay, thank you so much, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with all of you online and also in present. Firstly, I would like to thank UNDP and FAO for organizing this event, but also hosting also the MDB Pavilion for hosting this event. Scaling up action in agriculture and land use is urgent and necessary in order to meet the targets set out in the Paris Agreement. Private sector engagement will be key to implement the agriculture and land use priorities that countries have committed to in their recently revised National Determined Contributions and/or National Adaptation Plans. However, public climate finance allocation in this area is disproportionately low, representing only 22% of total climate finance in 2019. In terms of private finance flows, this sector has even been more marginalized. Now, and especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and its socio-economic consequences, private sector engagement is urgently required to scale up climate action and increase climate finance. During the pre-COP in Milan, more than 50 ministers and high-level representatives have recognized the need to expedite climate action by leveraging private finance, de-risking investment, and crowding in the private sector. They also committed to increase the engagement for private sector involvement. Business also urged to step up and align their current and future operations and their supply chains towards net zero emission targets and to make their value chains more climate resilient. Nevertheless, many challenges remain for private sector engagement. Companies need better climate data and climate risk information, financial incentives, and enabling environments. It would also help a lot to provide more information on emerging business opportunities that correspond to NDC and NAP priorities. Thus, there is a strong need to address these challenges in order to achieve climate-related goals in land use and agriculture. It is within this context that the German Ministry for the Environment, with its International Climate Initiative, that we call ICI in short, decided to launch the SCALA program during the COP25 in Madrid, together with our trusted partners UNDP and FAO. SCALA provides targeted support to 12 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The program uses the NDCs and NAPs of the respective countries as entry points to identify pathways for implementing climate action in the land and agriculture sector. To my mind, there are two aspects that set this program apart from other global programs of this nature. First, the implementation of innovative approaches such as systems thinking, cross-sectoral and inclusive approaches to planning, and secondly, private sector engagement. BMU is very happy to be present today at this event that marks the launch of an exciting new addition to SCALA's approach to private sector engagement, a technical assistance facility with 4 interrelated work streams to enhance private sector engagement. There is also great potential for a substantial role to be played by the private sector, especially that given the emerging investment opportunities in this space. In addition to help bridge the financing gap, the private sector can also be an important source of technical knowledge, human capital, and innovation. Please allow me in this context to also to mention an important process that we are currently working on in the ICI. We are developing a new overall strategy for the ICI until 2030, where we are also developing the current strength of ICI, but we will also focus and formulate new topics and modes of delivery. An intensified collaboration with the private sector will be a core element of this strategy. One example could be the involvement of private sector entities as consortium members of ICI projects, but we will also look into the involvement of the private sector as a funding source of climate and biodiversity action. In conclusion, I would like to stress that time is running, not just with regards to a 1-hour session, but more importantly also with regards to the urgency to transform the agriculture sector. This sector is like no other, of fundamental importance for securing the well-being and health of our society and ecosystems. I believe we all agree that this transformation can only be achieved through strong partnerships that include all stakeholders, from decision makers at the political level to smallholder farmers and representatives of private sector companies. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to hear the excellent set of speakers on the panel today provide interesting insights and experiences at different levels. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Birte. Wonderful, and thanks so much for outlining what the SCALA program is about, but also for emphasizing what the ICI scope is and that ICI is so interested in further engaging with the private sector and has a private sector strategy. That's really excellent news and very timely for COP26, where you have a lot of private sector running in the corridors and speaking at the panel. That's really definitely a shift we can see at the COP. So thanks so much for emphasizing also and recognizing the role that agriculture is part of climate solutions, and we need to work together on that. Thanks so much. So with further ado, I'd like to hand over to Neha Rai, who is a private sector and climate finance specialist in FAO, and she has a presentation prepared for us to outline some conceptual dimensions that then further inform the panel discussions which will follow. Neha, over to you.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm really grateful to be a part of this exciting session. I hope my presentation is now online. I think it's a very pertinent issue we're discussing today, not only because of its importance, but also it's quite timely for a few main reasons. And some of these reasons were already reflected by Birte earlier. But I would like to emphasize this a bit more before I go into some scene setting messaging today. I think one thing which is worth mentioning is the urgency in the agriculture sector, which IPCC has clearly allured. Countries need investment in practices that arrest emissions of major greenhouse gases, particularly methane and nitrogen oxide from agriculture sector, but also agriculture sector is severely impacted by agriculture related droughts emerging from extreme heat, particularly affecting actors down the supply chain. So role of businesses is quite crucial to address this urgency, not only to reduce emissions, but also to reduce the impacts of climate change on the entire value chains, particularly for farmers and communities. Secondly, growing commitments, and it's worth mentioning those because we listen to that a lot in COP. Countries are stepping up, signing up to net zero targets. They're part of the Race to Resilience campaign. Article 6 and carbon markets is a big agenda item at COP. And anticipating and adjusting to these regulatory shifts will be quite crucial for business success going further. The third aspect is finance. One of the agenda items at COP is to update 100 billion goal. But as we heard from Bertie, we know agriculture finance is declining. Also, less than 1% of climate finance or private climate finance is being spent in agriculture sector. And that's where we need to bring in the private sector to bridge the finance gap. And finally, the last point, which is the point I'm going to emphasize today, is that NDCs, which are the national climate plans, are giving policy signal to engage the private sector. We know in the new and enhanced NDCs, as well as the previous NDCs, agriculture continues to be a priority. All new and enhanced NDCs submitted to prior to COP mention about agriculture as a major priority. Many countries have not only updated their mitigation commitments, but a large number is also mentioning a clear role for businesses in the agriculture sector. And they're also moving towards investment planning. So there's a clear policy signal coming out from the private sector. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Next one. I think we have to go a bit further. Yeah. Next slide. Next one. Yes. I think, yes, here. I think it's something which I would like to focus on today's presentation, which is, for next 5-6 minutes, is while we discuss a lot about private sector engagement in NDCs, we really haven't unpacked what does NDCs talk about private sector. So it's good to unpack what are the NDCs mentioning about the private sector. And FAO has done a recent review to understand agriculture sector in NDCs submitted until 31st July. And an extension of this analysis looked into the role of private sector. And here today, I will share 3 main findings: to what extent private sector is engaged in NDC planning processes across these countries, what role do NDCs envision for private sector in the agriculture sector, and what have been the reference barriers to engagement. Next slide, please. So the first thing, many new NDCs refer to consultation of the private sector in the planning process. So nearly 60% say that. And we also saw the other UN report, which mentions high level of engagement of private sector. But what we really saw was that the quality of engagement is so low. Only some really mention examples of concrete engagement or active collaboration, only 13%. And most of these countries are Latin American countries like Colombia and Mexico, referencing greatest share of active collaboration by engaging businesses in decision-making around climate goals, while countries like Angola and Thailand refer to establishing concrete working groups to engage the private sector. In other countries, it's quite limited consultation processes that were held, but they still call that the private sector is involved, which is really quite shallow. And then countries such as DRC, Mongolia, Nepal have no mention of the private sector engagement so far. Next slide, please. So the other thing which is quite promising is while a limited number of NDCs refer to engaging the private sector in a concrete manner, a significant number of NDCs see a role for private sector in scaling up implementation, particularly in the agriculture sectors. For example, of the 41% that do mention engaging the private sector in delivering the ambition, we see that a large proportion clearly see a role for the businesses in the AFOLU sector, which is quite promising going further. Next slide, please. Next slide. The other thing which is worth mentioning is most countries see private sector's role in mitigation and cross-cutting areas, which is natural. But Africa and Asia also see role of businesses in adaptation in quite a lot of countries, which you can see clearly here is an outlier. Next slide, please. Majority and many updated NDCs refer to specific entry points for climate action in the agriculture sector, particularly from the private sector. And these are around forest systems and agri-food value chains, which pop up as the most prominent ones when we look across the figures. Next slide, please. When we look at the regional distribution, African, Latin American, and some of the Asian countries see a clear role for businesses in forestry and agriculture food value chains, while in Europe and Central Asian countries and the MENA region refer to the role of private sector in fisheries and cropping, which comes out as a prominent figure. Next slide, please. Finally, despite that NDCs have flagged the role of private sector in agriculture, many also refer to barriers for engagement. And these are knowledge and capacity barriers, financial barriers, political and governance barriers, and market barriers. And it's interesting to see that in African countries, there's a lot of specification around governance risk as a major impediment requiring specific de-risking, and financial barrier is a concern primarily across all countries. Next slide, please. So the findings from the NDC's review are quite insightful, and there are a lot of findings. I tried to focus on three main messages primarily because we want to focus on a few things for this session in itself, as we have interesting speakers who will allure a bit more about those agenda items. But we see that the private sector role is considered pertinent to expedite the agriculture sector commitments, and NDCs do refer to specific entry points, which is promising. But from the start, we also see businesses have limited engagement in NDC processes and climate action. And there are several barriers which are responsible for that, including regulatory, market, financial barriers, as I already mentioned. Now, to address some of these barriers, I would like to reflect on the FAO and UNDP program, SCALA, which aims to address some of these barriers. SCALA program, as already mentioned, stands for Scaling Up Climate Ambition on Land Use and Agriculture through NDCs and NAPs. And the program is designed to support countries to translate climate priorities for land use and agriculture into transformative action. And engaging the private sector or the businesses is a key component of the program. And in the program intends to do that by bringing public and the private sector together in NDC NAP discussion processes and in identifying priorities. Secondly, by enabling companies to identify climate solutions and helping in design of de-risking instruments that can help the companies invest in climate action. So over the year, what we've seen is some of the countries have already started prioritizing a key role for private sector. For example, in Costa Rica, grass-fed beef value chain identified as the main entry point, and the country is developing certification mechanisms for grass-fed beef and beef with forest cover by involving cooperatives, private companies in the process. Similarly, in Mongolia, the focus is on engaging businesses in pastoral restoration. In Thailand, sustainable rice practices is an area for private sector engagement. the SCALA money will aim to be catalytic and address some of these barriers. And beyond that, this work will also inform a study which is being carried out with FAO Investment Center on identifying de-risking instruments for engaging the businesses in climate action. I think our colleagues from World Business Council and others will further reflect on this partnership where we're working on the investment center work and the World Business Council. But I'll stop there in interest of time, and thanks for listening. And we have an excellent panel to reflect on some of these points that I highlighted.
Thank you so much, Neha. Wonderful. You wonderfully laid out the discussion in terms of looking at what a potential role of the private sector can be in engaging and scaling up action with regards to NDC NAPs. Thanks for giving some concrete examples that you expect to be worked on through the SCALA program. And with that, I'd like now to introduce the way we want to run the panel discussion. We have 4 panel members, 2 in person and 2 virtual. And what we try to do is to really give different perspectives, because we believe that part of the working together and learning how to work together between the public and the private sector is to learn each other's vocabulary and deepen the understanding. So that's why we really cared about inviting different perspectives. So here we have the perspective of a government, we have a perspective of the private sector, we have a perspective of financier, and of an investor network, yeah, last not least, also of foundations working with the private sector. So this is just to set out a little bit of ambition for this panel discussion. And I will introduce the panel speakers as we go. We have 4 of them. So I'm very honored to start with our first speaker, Mr. Richmond Aussie. He's the coordinator for the NDC support program with UNDP. He's from Côte d'Ivoire, and I have a question for you. So to discuss these opportunities we've been hearing, I would like to ask you if you can give us concrete examples. What's your experience in designing, but also forward coming to do the implementation, right, of the NDC priorities that your country has set out? Please, over to you.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity you gave us to discuss this very important topic. This topic has a double importance for our country, for Côte d'Ivoire. Let me tell you why. Firstly, the AFOLU sector is identified as one major sector for GHG emissions that we need to make concrete actions to reduce. And secondly, AFOLU is also a very important sector for our economy. So in Côte d'Ivoire, the main economy sector is agriculture and also land use. So climate emergency means for us economic emergency. So we need to move forward in those approach and have everybody get inside, particularly private sector, who have a very big potential to mobilize financial resources and make investment in our agriculture and land use. Private sector is actually deeply engaged in our climate change commitment implementations. For that, they are directly engaged in support small farmers and small landholders to be more resilient. For example, by support the government designing an early warning system, for example, and also to support a government to work concretely to help small and agriculture people how to make more resilient their agriculture and how to have a very interesting and very good productions to help livelihood. From the side of government, there are a lot of initiatives we are concretely implement to enhance and create a very good environment for NDCs and also a NAP and climate change commitment implementations. For example, we work closely with the private sector, the main cooperation of private sector to develop our first climate and private sector building plans to build the capacity. So this is interesting, and this is ongoing implementation actually. We have a common identified the need of private sector to be more active in NDCs and NAP commitment implementations. So this is a very interesting approach we develop to engage more private sector inside. And also we work very closely to adopt a law for climate change in order to create a very good environment and very good and to create very enable environment for implementations of all climate change issues, climate change aspects, in order to have a very good approach, public and private partnership in Côte d'Ivoire. Also, we are actually preparing our first green bond emissions for Côte d'Ivoire, in particularly for the main economic sectors such as agriculture, land use, sometimes forestry, and also energy. This will be a very interesting approach to have some investment and to enhance investment in adaptations, in also mitigations, also for agriculture, and help some main crops to be more competitive at international level and to reduce the destroy of crops and some farms. Also, we are now trying to experiment our first index insurance for agriculture and land use. Few years ago in Côte d'Ivoire, we have some farmers who have lost many hectares of crops, of land, because of flood and drought. So this was catastrophic for them, for the resources mobilization. So this is why we are deeply engaged in area warning systems and also in index insurance. We are developing pilot one for agriculture and also land use. Let me tell about what we are doing concretely with private sector to maybe help them identify and also cover potential risk of and impact that may affect their performance. Yes, in the approach of implementation, and also identify economic opportunities, climate change technology transfers, and new approach to have innovative and climate change investment. So this is why we are actually working, and it's very interesting to develop in our country the partnerships between public and private to support agriculture and to support our economic. As I said, climate emergency means for us an economic emergency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richmondi. I guess we can have the full panel session just on Côte d'Ivoire, which is a very interesting case. So thank you so much to mention public-private partnership, index insurance, and some really concrete example. And sorry, we have to be short, but we'd like to collect some other perspectives. So with that, I'd like to invite the second virtual speaker this time, Rebecca Mincy. She's the investment director at Acumen Resilience Agriculture Fund, ARAF in short, and she has several years of experience in agriculture impact investing and assets management over the last couple of years. So I have also a question for you, Rebecca. We would like to learn from you what kind of challenges you have found in your work, and how do you think that Acumen can incentivize and give a stimulation, a financial incentive to small businesses, in particular with regards to the NAPs and NDC implementation? Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Rebecca. I work for the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, and we are sponsored by Acumen, and we are anchored by the Green Climate Fund. And essentially, we are a $58 million venture capital fund. And our goal is to invest in agribusinesses that help smallholder farmers adapt to climate change. And I said that slowly because there are a couple of things to pay attention to. So the first thing is that is the word adapt. So in the larger climate resilience space, there's mitigation, climate mitigation, and there's climate adaptation. Mitigation being greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and adaptation meaning kind of changing farmer practices. So we play in and we invest in companies that are basically in the adaptation space. And so we help farmers become better farmers in the context of a changing climate. So that's the first kind of thing to note about us. When I say that we are sponsored by Acumen and anchored by the Green Climate Fund, our investment strategy is a combination of listening to and reviewing the adaptation strategies of the companies that we work, countries that we work in. We work in 4 countries, which I'll explain later. But our strategies is based on it's twofold, on what the countries want as part of their national adaptation plans, but it's also rooted in what we've learned as commercial investors over the last 10 years. And so basically we invest in companies, like I said, that help smallholder farmers adapt to climate change. We look for ag tech companies, we look for ag finance companies, and we look for agro-processors, broadly speaking. And what we've learned commercially is that companies who provide what we call a bundled set of solutions, or these platform solutions, are the most commercially viable. And I can again explain more of that later on. But for us, the reason why we deploy capital, the reason why we get up in the morning is to make smallholder farmers more resilient to changes in climate. And how do we do that in the context of small businesses? In short, we only fund businesses that are helping smallholder farmers. We have a pre-screening tool that we use before we invest to help us to get directionally clear on whether or not a company is going to impact smallholder farmers and improve the resilience of smallholder farmers. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we do is that we actually, in addition to the capital that we provide to companies, we actually measure changes in climate resilience of the farmers over time. So yes, we're involved in the commercials of the business, but we actually have a really strong impact focus. So we do a baseline survey at the time of our investment, and then after every 12 to 18 months, we are doing follow-up surveys to see if over time, farmers are demonstrating and engaging in the type of behavior that will lead them to become more climate resilient. And so for us at the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, we see climate and the commercial side of the business as being integrally connected. So the private sector is no more divorced from climate than any other sector. And so it is just the coming together of these two parts that really is the core of what we do. We also provide, in addition to capital, equity, so we take an ownership stake. In addition to equity, we also have a technical assistance facility that we make available to our companies to help them to figure out how to best support smallholder farmers to become more climate resilient. We provide that grant capital, and then that grant capital is used to help them experiment and to innovate. And before they actually are able to scale some of these new climate-focused initiatives to change farmer behavior, to get them to adopt more climate-smart practices, to make available indexed insurance options, the company can iterate and see what makes sense from a commercial standpoint before they go big across multiple geographies. So, in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but I hope that that's a little bit clearer in terms of how we incentivize companies. And I think the last bit you asked about barriers. I mean, there are so many. There is everything from low yields in the markets where we work. There's logistical issues. There's a lack of available working capital. But these are all problems that our entrepreneurs and small businesses are solving for every day, that we provide both grant capital as well as equity to help them to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been so interesting and very hope-giving, because there's over 2 billion smallholder farmers in the world, and what we hear as well in in COP is that agriculture is part of the climate solutions, and so are the farmers, right? We need the agents of change, and you really nicely explain how you see this coming together and give a lot of hope by also sharing your personal motivation and getting up in the morning. So that's really wonderful. So let me, in terms of the proceeding time, go over to Maria Lettini. And I'm really, really curious to hear from you. She's the Executive Director of FAIR, and I hope you explain that to the listeners. It's a global network of over 300 investors with 35 trillion, I'm not reading mistakenly, it actually says trillion, in combined assets. And she has over 20 years of experience in global investment banking, business, and finance. That's really amazing. And the question I'd like to ask you is, what do you do as FAIR in particular to engage with the private sector and make sure that the investments that seem to be huge are aligned with government priorities through NDC and NAPs? Over to you.
Well, great, and I'm delighted to be here and give my contribution. And I guess the FAIR approach is slightly different than all my fellow speakers. So we are a global institutional investor network, as was explained. So our members sign up to receive research and to access our practical tools and to be involved in our collaborative investor engagement, which we do with listed corporates, right? So we bring everyone together, we're a free organization under a big tent, and really what we're striving to do is highlight the risks and opportunities in the agriculture and animal agriculture sector as it pertains to the wider, broader food system challenges. So we work on a variety of different issues, and of course, very importantly on climate change. When we think about emissions in this sector, obviously we need to work very closely and align ourselves with what government's ambitions are for each one of their emissions reductions as well. And I'm actually quite optimistic because in many cases I think we may all agree that the private sector can be a couple steps ahead from the public sector, particularly because when we, again, deal with listed companies, we often have investors in these companies as being pretty significant levers of change. And on the institutional investor agenda, climate change and emissions has been sort of at the forefront of the risks which they have been engaging on in order to safeguard the value of long-term investment portfolios. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a background on how we sort of engage with private sector listed companies in the capital markets. But what I think we are seeing with the companies that we cover in the food sector is some really fantastic public commitments around emissions reductions. And I think as we see countries make announcements as well, we're going to have to see them align with some of the biggest emitting industries. And we know that agriculture and animal agriculture make up 30% of global emissions. So just to give you a bit of a flavor on how we engage with some of these companies. So for example, over the past 12 to 18 months, a lot of public announcements from these companies. We engage, for example, with some of the global fast food companies, McDonald's, Yum Brands, RBI. Obviously, they have operations in various jurisdictions around the world, which obviously has implications for emissions in a number of different countries. So their global footprint is large. The fast food companies, Scope 3 emissions represent 99% of their GHG emissions, and of that, half pertain to meat, chicken, and dairy. So this year, even with our own engagement with our investor members, we've seen 3 out of the 6 large fast food companies we're engaging with actually announce net zero targets. Now imagine the difficulty when the supply chains are massive. We've actually seen 4 of them set science-based targets as well. So we find that really encouraging. We also engage with global food manufacturers and retailers. And on that side, it's, again, been quite a long process to have them start thinking about how they can tap into their product portfolios and how that could help them align with reduction targets. But when you're thinking about global manufacturers and retailers, 92% of their emissions are linked to Scope 3. So they're actually setting targets around emissions reductions, thinking about their product portfolios and how they may be able to change or diversify away from some high-emitting products in protein, for example, animal protein, and replace those with some plant-based options, which allows them to, again, meet some of their very ambitious climate goals. And then even the protein producers themselves, I mean, through our own proprietary research, we have found that if meat producers don't actually begin to think about reducing their overexposure to meat, the very asset that they are known to produce, and start thinking about the impact of incoming climate prices, they actually have over 11 billion of EBITDA at risk out to 2050. So even with those protein producer companies, we are actually seeing many of those set science-based targets, and that's, you know, obviously very impressive. But one thing I would like to highlight, and this is where we need everything to begin to marry up, and it's very important, we are seeing still inconsistent disclosure, incomplete disclosure, and the sector is still underreporting on really important emissions coming from animal farming, feed production, and land use change. So, I mean, we know countries won't be able to meet their climate targets without industry taking a leading charge. And we also, as been previously mentioned, obviously outlined very nicely in the initial report, we need to see countries have specific emissions reduction targets as it pertains to agriculture. And we have investors with over 12 trillion of assets under management, which signed an investor letter in the run-up to COP with support of former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, asking countries specifically to set ag reduction emission targets alongside their NDCs. Thus far, I mean, we haven't seen specific targets, and we know that's in stark contrast to the energy sector. So we want to continue to push on this front, and we think that countries can work very closely with industry and companies within that sector with support of investors to reach the 1.5 degree target that we need to maintain.
Thank you so much, Maria. And thanks for reminding us that the agri-food system has actually 30% of the share of the total emissions. So that's really, really important to note. And you wonderfully outline how in partnership, you know, not only governments actually do net zero announcements, but actually also companies are thinking how they can reduce in their value chain and their production chain. And also we hear increasingly net zero announcements from the private sector. I had the pleasure to be in the Obama speech this morning or this afternoon, and he said partnership is leadership, and that what you present is very much along these lines, that you don't see it as like one company alone. It's actually bringing and convening partners around challenging objectives. And I also like how you outlined some of the challenges ahead, and I hear high motivation that you will be one of the ones pushing that forward. So thank you so much, Maria. That was really inspiring. As the last and fourth speaker, I'm very pleased to greet our online speaker, Tony Sino-Tonas. He leads the World Business Council for Sustainable Development program on scaling positive agriculture. I'm sure you will share what is this all about. He's been working in the space of climate change, agriculture, and sustainable development over 15 years. And I have a question for you too. I'd like to ask you how your organization is planning to encourage food and agriculture companies to meet climate commitments and build resilience within the supply chain. So what are some of the elements you propose to them, and what is their reaction? Over to you.
Thanks, Julia. So yeah, just great to hear some of the other speakers talk about the progress in this space right now. At WBCSD, we've been working on this pre-competitive climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and climate smart agriculture space since 2015. And really back then, this wasn't really a topic particularly high on the agenda. We've seen this amazing progress on COP26, talking about the role of agriculture as a solution, a positive solution for climate, but also really interestingly and importantly for nature and for livelihoods as well. I think there are some sort of big needs and approaches that we need to think about here. We need to have the type of CEO level targets that we've heard about already. That's really important. And then I want to talk a bit more about the adaptation and mitigation elements of what we've heard about from the private sector side. So just this piece about commitments, we're seeing outstanding commitments come from the agricultural space. We've heard already about the science-based targets being met, but I think that COP26 has supercharged that, particularly through the commitments being made on methane and deforestation, both of which agriculture plays a huge role in tackling. And this alignment between public and private sector means that you're having this rapid coming together of companies who are going to invest into this. But we also believe that it's important that they do that in a way which is openly and transparently disclosed under mechanisms like the TCFD, so that that investment is made at scale, as well as grounded in human rights and equity. So that is really helping make a change. Nestle, $1.2 billion investment into achieving their net zero strategy, but also regenerative practices that drive resilience as well through the value chain. But we need more consistent ways for companies to understand how these investments are made. At the moment, there's no real clarity on what the return on those investments are. I think for investors, I think we could do better on that. And we really believe at WBCSD that working on an investment roadmap that would define consistent approaches for companies to invest into climate smart techniques, regenerative agricultural practices, but also livelihoods would really help get to the scale that's needed here. Adaptation, I want to talk about just in the time that I've got. I think that that's going to be super important. In a 2+, 3+ degree world. Some of those numbers are scary. And if you look at the African Sahel countries under SCALA, then we have to find ways for the private sector to bring digital climate advisory services, bundled services. 90% of the market across sub-Saharan Africa for that market remains untapped. And so there's huge opportunity there. On mitigation, we heard about Thailand too. I mean, this is a big rice producing country, has a big footprint of methane associated with that. We've been working with FAO, GIZ for the last 3 years on investments into sustainable rice practices, helping smallholders to produce, but also bringing off-takers and finance players to put public-private blended finance facilities in place. So what next? Well, we're really excited to be working with FAO and UNDP's SCALA initiative to look in particular at this question about targets, because all the companies we speak to in WBCSD want to implement change on the ground. And we need to help them do that through the NDCs, through the targets that they've committed to, but also the NAPs. And we really have to help through partnership build the capacity of these companies to know how to engage with governments. We heard from Neha the level or the low level of quality engagement on NDCs. Well, how do we build the capacity of governments and companies to actually have the right kind of conversation about meeting NDC or NAP targets? With farmers, how do we help companies actually engage with farmer groups, especially smallholder farmer groups, cooperatives, and working through international development, bilateral donors, to implement the changes on the ground that those farmers want? I think at the moment, there's not an active enough dialogue between the private sector, small, medium, and large, and actual farmers who are also part of that private sector to really understand what's needed along the value chain. So we're really excited about where all of this is going. And I think looking past COP26 to COP27, it will be really interesting to have an African-hosted COP next year. We're greatly excited about that, talking about some of these fundamental needs, and I think helping to put agriculture again front and center on the agenda as we go forward. So yeah, some exciting work ahead. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tony. This has been wonderful. I'd liked how you referred to the needs to target setting, which needs to happen in collaboration between the private and the public sector, and also placing your discussion and the panel discussion in COP26, even without being there, and a future looking to COP27 in Africa. So that's all wonderful. So now, given we are a little ahead of time, I will not conclude this very interesting panel session, but actually invite Sri Lata to celebrate with all of us together our little moment of launch of this of a new technical assistance facility, in particular for the small, for least developed countries, because we want to take things beyond just dialogue. And that was one of the key motivations why the technical facility was set up. So Sri Lata, let me quickly introduce you. Sri Lata Kamila, she's the head of climate change adaptation in UNDP and the Bureau for Policy and Program Support. And she's responsible for strategic leadership and is overseeing a really large portfolio with more than over 100 countries. So please, over to you for the launch.
Thank you very much, Julia. It's been a very, very interesting discussion amongst the panelists, and it's actually a very optimism-inducing conversation so far. Let me start by saying I'm really delighted to be part of this event. I'd like to thank BMU for their sustained support for the work UNDP and FAO have been doing jointly now as a second phase of the work that started with NAPs and scaling this up to really integrating this work on land use agriculture and NDCs. And this conversation that now talks really about aligning and convening and putting together the public and private sector efforts and incentives and investments towards scaling up, both on the decarbonization side as well as on the adaptation, is really music to our ears, and I'm very, very delighted to be part of this. I just want to make sure, Julia, the presentation is set up. We can go to the first slide. I'll make sure we are. The next slide, please. Just wanted to frame it a little bit. Many of our speakers spoke about a little bit the overview of the SCALA program itself, but also this particular topic on engaging private sector. We wanted to say that the approach to private sector engagement for the SCALA is very much in line, excuse me, for UNDP's overall private sector strategy, as well as Neha mentioned about the FAO. And I just wanted to point out here that it was interesting to hear that when we speak of private sector, there's a lot of perspectives. And one of the important things for us to keep in mind that it's not a homogeneous sector when we talk about private sector, from MSMEs and smallholders in this case, to value chain actors, to agribusinesses, to financiers, and there's a lot of dots along this overall agriculture, food systems, value chains, and the land use sectors. Where we engage with private sector, we need to keep that in mind, and therefore we need to understand how the barriers Neha and others spoke about apply to different actors and different pillars of what we consider private sector. But with SCALA, I think that's one of the things we also wanted to make sure comes across in the engagement with private sector. And the 12 SCALA program countries, the approach for engagement is really, it'll support building an environment, and many speakers again spoke about an enabling environment. But how do we engage businesses and engage them and connect the investments and engagement to the NAPs and NDCs at the country level, with also a view that the SCALA program, as it works in various countries, it also informs best practices, lessons, and the dialogue we're having at the global level to advance private sector engagement in both the mitigation and adaptation elements of the land use agriculture space. A third key pillar of the SCALA's private sector work will also involve drawing on the emerging lessons learned from the partnerships and the work in the SCALA countries, but also with the aim that it'll also help scale up and exchange of lessons with other countries that are not part of the targeted set of countries under SCALA. If you could move to slide 3, please. With this, I'm very pleased to announce the launch of SCALA's Technical Assistance Facility. This facility will offer a range of services, and many of you will recognize the services itself that, actually, sorry, Julia, can I ask the slide to be where the pillars of the Technical Assistance Facility are mentioned? Maybe back to slide 2. Sorry, if we could go back. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. Oh, no. Let's just stay on slide 2, please. Previous slide. Thank you. Just here, as you'll recognize actually, and this is really amazing to see that a lot of speakers spoke about many barriers to private sector engagement. And you'll see that the TA facility, the 4 work streams it looks at, really, it resonates with being able to de-risk and address some of the barriers. So from outreach and opportunity mapping, so understanding, and Tony, you mentioned this towards the end, and Neha in the beginning, when we look at analyzing NDC and NAP priorities for this sector, how do we then look at private sector and really align that with the and map them to the areas and interests of, in the NDCs and NAPs, that some that have been mentioned, but also connect to this continued effort as countries continue to look at updating their NDCs and targets, both for mitigation and adaptation relevant to this sector. A second pillar of this facility focuses on facilitating multi-stakeholder engagement, again, convening public and private sector actors to jointly determine climate action initiatives that help advance private sector engagement. A third pillar is really about assessing risks and opportunities. And again, this came up as theme, not only in the examples that were shared by our government speaker from Cote d'Ivoire, but also from the work that FAIR is doing, is how do you really help private sector assess the risks, but also the opportunities for investment in these sectors that, again, amplify the work both from the public and private sector side to enhance investment, both in decarbonization and resilience building for the sector. And then finally, the pillar of the facility that really actions these priorities and the multi-stakeholder engagements in identifying the policy and financial instruments that can be collectively advanced in being able to de-risk private sector investment, remove some of the market barriers, improve policy, regulatory environment that underlie some of the governance barriers that were earlier mentioned, and really being able to look at the entire value chain from smallholders, again, to multinationals, to access to finance, and technology and insurance, other elements that all come into play for agriculture land use sector, and what kinds of instruments can be promoted in advancing this engagement. Move to slide 3, please. Just a little overview, and I'm sure more details can be shared by the program team. But in terms of the operationalizing of the facility and the timeline, all developing countries are eligible. Those that are eligible for ODA would be eligible for requesting support from the TA facility across the work streams that I just outlined. During the first phase, however, which will get launched early 2022, priority will be given to requests from the 47 LDCs. As we all recognize, the most vulnerable to climate change, and again, as one of our speakers amplified, for many of these countries, climate crisis is an emergency and it's an economic crisis. So there will be a focus on LDCs. There will be certain set of criteria to vet requests, again, ensuring country priorities, the alignment is there with the NDC and NAP priorities, ensuring that we are looking at decarbonization and/or resilient land use and agricultural practices with the support that would be provided under the facility, and also gender. And this is one of the themes that underpin the work of SCALA, and ensuring gender both in terms of as women as beneficiaries, but also as change agents, This is a predominant consideration when we talk about advancing private sector engagement as well, and crowding in other private sector and public sector finance through the request.
Thank you so much.
We need to look at is leverage.
Thank you so much, Srilata. Unfortunately, we have to close the session.
Yeah. Thanks. Now I was going to say, with that, let me stop and if there's questions on how the rollout, I'm sure the program team can respond. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this launch and celebration and outlining how the facility is supposed to work. With that, I'd like to thank very much the panelists and the in-person panelists who took time to come to the MDB Pavilion, the virtual panelists. I really, really enjoyed the exchange. I hope it's just the beginning of new ideas, new partners. I see plenty of opportunities. I guess we all can agree that private sector engagement and private sector commitment is a cornerstone of moving ahead on the Paris Agreement implementation. It's 5 years now that the Paris Agreement is alive, and we all are committed to it. It gave me a lot of hope hearing from the private sector representatives that there's actually a lot of things happening, which is sometimes invisible also to government. So let's keep doing the exchange and identify opportunities, how we can really work together and make an impact on the ground, because this is what all it matters. And thanks so much to the African Development, UNDP, FAO colleagues in the back to make it happen. It has been a wonderful event. Thank you so much.